Are you a parent navigating the complexities of co-parenting, family court, or even domestic violence? If you are looking for ways to help protect your children and build a strong and supportive community around you, then look no further. Gray Minds Think Alike is your go-to resource for everything related to the complexities of family life. Join us as we dive into thoughtful conversations with experts and explore practical tips and strategies for tackling the challenges of parenthood in the throes of adversity so that no parent feels alone and every child's safety is protected. Hi, everyone, and welcome to Gray Minds Think Alike. In our virtual studio today, we have Dr. Catherine Barrett, a licensed clinical forensic psychologist based out of Los Angeles, California. With a master's degree in marriage and family therapy, Catherine uses her training and experience to help those committed to social justice. Dr. Barrett specializes in addiction recovery, domestic and intimate partner violence, chronic mental illness, and narcissistic abuse, a topic that I know all too well. Hi, Catherine. Thank you so much for chatting with us today.
Thank you for having me.
I would love to hear a little bit about your background.
Yeah, sure. I'll give you the Cliff's Notes because It's a little bit lengthy, but yeah, you have that absolutely right. So I do have a master's degree in marriage and family therapy, which is where my clinical emphasis comes in. Started working in domestic violence very early on at the end of actually my bachelor's degree. After pursuing my master's, I went and completed a doctoral degree in forensic psychology. And so I basically took both of those degrees and married them with a dual focus in clinical and forensic work. A lot of my background in my doctoral work was actually working with the perpetrators, doing risk assessments and assessing what their level, if at all, should be in reintegrating back into the community. These are folks who committed pretty heinous offenses. Some of them were due to mental illness, but others were due to antisocial personality disorder, otherwise known sometimes as psychopathy, narcissistic personality disorder, sex offenders, sexually violent predators. After I finished all of that work, I went back to a clinical practice for a while, and I needed a little bit of a break from that, as you can imagine. And through the course of that, I ended up starting to, first of all, I went through my own experience of being in a narcissistically abusive relationship, which was the first time I had to recognize that this exists, right? A lot of us don't even understand this until we're in it, which a lot of my clients will say, how could you not know if you were assessing psychopaths and sociopaths and narcissists? Because right. I share this only because many folks feel a lot of guilt and shame. And if someone like myself with all the knowledge and academia and all of that could be baited into it, anybody can. And so from there, I started to see a lot of clients who were experiencing this. And then I was linked to colleagues in the field through some of the presentations and things that I was doing who said, hey, we really need you in family court. And so I started to work alongside some folks that brought me into that. And then eventually it was just this merger of personal, professional, clinical, and forensic expertise that now here I am, really not by accident, because I'm glad I've been able to offer as much as I can, but it really was a happy accident and how I got here.
Can you tell us, because I'm not even sure I know, what exactly forensic psychologist means?
Forensic psychologist, essentially someone who is trained in the psycholegal framework. And what I mean by that is it's the use of psychology within the legal system. So what differentiates clinical from forensic psychology is like a subdivision of clinical psychology, with an emphasis in being trained to assist the courts and helping them understand maybe levels of risk, helping them understand somebody's propensity for a certain behavior. It focuses much more on what we know right now versus the potential, right? So when we think of clinical psychology, we think of individuals who are focused more on treatment recommendations, mental health diagnoses. There are aspects of that in forensic psychology, but really our role is to assist the trier of fact, assist the court in understanding this is who is in front of us, this is what is going on, and this is what this could mean from either levels of protective factors or risk factors. That's like the oversimplified way of explaining that.
How do you do that? How do you risk assessment? How do you do that?
Most of the training in forensic psychology is understanding risk through learning different ways of assessing, learning very strategic ways of interviewing somebody, understanding that just by talking to someone that our guess is in our clinical perception or assessment is really only good as a flip of a coin, which means if you are interviewing somebody, you have about a 50% chance of accurately assessing them unless you are using other forms of information, psychological tools. This is where I oftentimes get into debates with the court about who they might choose to hire, because if you don't have a training in forensics, then there's this lack of knowledge or competency in the importance of knowing how to assess as accurately as possible. And I also think that also includes having lot of training and background in risk assessment, such as domestic violence, intimate partner violence, and how domestic violence no longer looks just like a caveman with a club. That we've really come a long way in understanding emotional violence and the sophistication of offenders in their presentation when we're interviewing them, to just go based on what they're saying or go based on listening to a therapist who may not have the training to fully understand the pathology. This is where a lot of these folks slip through the cracks.
Right. And I'm assuming that in cases, that this is needed, how important is getting a risk assessment and a psych eval for court cases?
Yeah. So I'll share with you, I ended up doing a training for judges at the last conference for the National Judicial Conference for Juvenile and Family Court Judges last July in Arizona. And much of my training was in helping them understand the importance of vetting folks that they use to do these evaluations. And a lot of my conversation was around these incestuous sort of circles of professionals that they tend to use over and over in their jurisdictions, because I get it. They know them, they're familiar with them. Maybe the evaluator's been working for 35, 40 years doing these. But what I find when I end up doing product reviews on these evaluations are these are individuals with no training in coercive control, domestic violence, intimate partner violence. They've never worked with perpetrators. Their last continuing education was in 1980 or 1990 when domestic violence looked very different.
Absolutely.
And also, I think that we have to remember, and this is important for clients to know when they're vetting as well, domestic violence, to get your license, whether it be in clinical psychology, forensic psychology, under the Board of Psychology, we are only required about 3 units of domestic violence training to get our licensures, which means like 1 class. Now, I teach this at a graduate level, and I happen to bring in a lot of the stuff that isn't mandated to be taught in these classes. These classes are mostly around reporting laws and mandated reporting, but it very rarely gets into personality disorders and coercive control. So the court, I think, makes assumptions that if you are a psychologist, then you must be an expert in domestic violence. And that could not be further from the truth.
Right. It is like a niche category.
Very much.
Yeah. Now, I always say that, especially I always talk about lawyers. If they're family lawyers, learning about DV should be a part of their job, considering
100%.
how many people are in divorces and with children. But sadly, they don't consider that a priority.
Yeah, they don't consider it a priority because I think they oversimplify domestic violence. And I think that unfortunately, what I tend to see sometimes is these layers of pseudo justice. It takes a lot of courage for someone to step up and say, I've been abused, or my child's being abused, or there's a fear that they might be being abused, because we know historically victims are not believed.
Right.
I point people to Ann Burgess's work all the time. And if people don't know who she was a psychiatric nurse back in the 70s that is actually responsible for the FBI having an empirical way to psychologically profile offenders. And she did this through listening to victims of sexual violence. And she said, we can learn a lot about our perpetrators by believing and listening to our victims. But that all erased when we brought people like Richard Gardner into family court.
For me, I didn't even know I was in domestic violence until after the fact, because I didn't know anything about coercive control. I never heard the term. I didn't know all of the things that were happening for 4 years was actually something in domestic violence, where I think as my lawyer, the judges, if they were trained in this, they should have been like, hey, these are the red flags that are coercive control. This is something that we need to look into. But I think everyone just thinks everyone is normal and doesn't have psychotic tendencies where someone can just snap and kill their child, which is what happened in my case, although I don't think he snapped. This was in the works since he was probably a child.
Oh my gosh. I think that's so well stated. And there's a couple of things I'll add on to that, which is one, Gavin de Becker has a wonderful book called The Gift of Fear. And Gavin de Becker is the lead threat assessment person in the world. And he almost witnessed his mother dying through domestic violence when he was a child and ended up becoming an accessory for the FBI as a child and helping them understand how something like this happened. Then he grew into this work. And The Gift of Fear addresses just that. Nobody snaps overnight. The problem is, everything you just said is there's a diffusion of responsibility, which is I don't want to be the person who's going to call out a parent or assume that a parent is violent or that anybody's violent, a child, a neighbor, a student, right? So when you think about threat assessment, what we know when we look back at folks who have taken a gun to a university or in your case, unfortunately, the death of a child, these are things that if you do what's called a psychological autopsy, we can look back and go, there is so much evidence leading to the fact that we had enough to at least pull this person aside and contain them. Whether that was because they were a psychopath or they were incredibly mentally ill, things don't happen people don't snap like that. In addition to that, because there's this diffusion of responsibility and this sort of air to, I don't want to accuse this person, and I don't want to overuse the word I'm about to use, but it can create a form of gaslighting in the victim or the target who's in the relationship because no one's talking about the fact that this person could be dangerous. And so it's a perfect storm for allowing this individual to get more and more pathological while the target or the victim is carrying the moral responsibility of how do I fix this? Am I making it up in my mind? And then the next thing you know, there's this tragedy that happens. But in hindsight, we all can look back and go, we saw it coming. And this is where the courts fail us.
Right. Yeah, no, absolutely. And I was told by the perpetrator that he had post-traumatic stress disorder and joined a cult after college. So we knew that insanity was there. And
many warning signs. Yeah,
there were many warning signs. Lawyers and judges, they just think everyone's normal. And what father would kill their child? That's just crazy.
That's just it, is this disbelief that somebody,
yes.
And I think that there's this overcorrection. Like we don't have to over pathologize every parent that walks into family court. But I do think that we have to be aware that people can be unwell. And people can also be psychopathological. That both can be true. People don't always kill because they're psychopaths. And I'm not justifying anybody's actions if they kill and they aren't psychopaths. What I'm suggesting is it happens more than we think. It's happened in my own practice. To my associate had a client whose daughter died horrifically after we tried warning the evaluators that she shouldn't have unsupervised visits. And how many more? And I said to these judges in July, I said, how many more children have to die?
I know.
For you guys to maybe err to the side of caution the other way.
It will take until something happens to them and their family. Or when it comes that close to home is when they'll actually start realizing that things need to change.
Yeah, that's right.
Sadly. Because all that happened with me in my case. And I've definitely talked to moms around the country or fathers that have been through similar tragic stories with their child or loved one. And it happens and it's happening everywhere. And it's happening at an alarming rate.
Yes, it is.
So
it is.
Do you work with One Mom's Battle and Tina Swithin?
I do. Yeah. So Tina is definitely one of the people from the very beginning who we connected and how I got into a lot of this work and learning her story.
Yes.
Just remarkable human for everything that she's done and what she continues to do. This is hard work. We're in a constant uphill battle as we are the minority. We are the hysterical, pathologized, histrionic people that are trying to stop justice in a lot of people's minds. This is the fight, unfortunately.
Yeah, no, I've spoken to Tina. She was actually on this podcast. So she's been very instrumental in helping me get extra resources for this podcast and just in general for my healing, I guess you can say.
It astounds me the amount of mostly women, some men, who have gone through this. And the more that I've been doing this work, and I've even had some people in my personal life say, Catherine, I've heard you talk about this, but now it's happening to me. This is everywhere. And I'm like, it is, unfortunately, but you don't get it until you're going through it or you are somehow affiliated with it. You just don't believe it's a thing.
And something that we were just talking about in my situation, Grayson's father didn't hurt Grayson because he didn't love him or he didn't want to be a father. He did it just to hurt me because he knew it was the only thing that would actually hurt me and upset me and ruin my life, because everything else he threw at me, I just let it roll off my shoulder. I went on. I was trying to have a very happy life. And he actually loved Grayson. They had a good relationship. And he solely did this just to hurt me.
Yeah,
so
he loved himself more.
He loved hating me more than he loved his child, which he ended his life as well. He could have just done that if moving away wasn't his solution. But this is the solution that he chose, to end 2 lives, and mine virtually.
Yeah.
Even though I'm still here. But that's the route that he took. Now, how does one know that they need a forensic psychologist? Or I probably could have benefited by having one.
I think it's the capacity in which someone is using one. As far as if you're looking for a therapist, which is one role that I play, a therapist, it doesn't matter if they're forensic or clinical, as long as they understand coercive control. Then to me, whether you're an MFT, an LPCC, a social worker, a psychologist, I don't care, as long as this person has competency and affirmation around what this is and that you trust their credentials. When we're dealing with, and we're dealing with evaluations, and we're dealing with expert testimony, and we're dealing with someone who understands the psycholegal framework, I think it's important to have someone not, and here's another thing too, as an aside, not someone who calls themselves a forensic psychologist because they've worked in the court system. What does their degree say? Because if you're clinically trained, and this is not, I don't want to make this about ranking, because clinical psychologists are excellent as clinical psychologists, but it's in our academia. Like, I took classes just on expert testimony. I took classes just on risk assessment. I took classes on court documentation, on how to assist the trier of fact. This is not taught in clinical work. So clinical work is taught from the framework of everyone can get better through therapy, mostly, okay? To be honest with you, that's not entirely incorrect, but the focus is on treatment goals, recommendations. The problem with that mindset is we also have to recognize sometimes that isn't the case. That we have folks who are not in the capacity of self-reflection, remorse, empathy, introspection, whatever it might be needed to either be a healthy parent or partner or co-parent, or have any sort of amenability to treatment. And the only way that we can accurately assess that is if we have profound knowledge in risk assessment, personality disorders, domestic violence, and how to address a court that way. And I think that is a very particular type of training. Now, that doesn't mean that all forensic psychologists do family court either. You have to make sure that there's forensic psychologists that work on workers' comp for neurological damage because someone fell off a ladder at work. So you still have to be looking for someone who has an expertise in trauma-informed care and intimate partner violence. So this is where it can get very overwhelming for people when they're doing the search. And I was actually on the phone with a guardian ad litem yesterday who was doing a consultation with me because no one has ever broken this down this way. And we keep hiring all these people. I said, yeah, that's why these cases last 7, 8, 9 years, because then they realize the evaluation's wrong. It no longer matters. Now we have to go back to the drawing board. And that just puts the victims, whether that be the healthy parent or preferred parent and the children, just under so much more stress and trauma, that my job is to help educate people on, let's get it right from the beginning. Right. And my job as an educator is to put clinicians out in the field as psychotherapists who understand this and see this and can help their clients really find the right people to build these teams. Because more often than not, it's chosen by the judge who has no idea how to vet these folks that they use. So how does it get introduced into a case? How would I have gotten a forensic psychologist to do you do psych evals? Could I have gotten a psych eval on Grayson's father? I personally used to do the evals, and now most of the time I'm hired in to do product reviews on the evaluations to make sure that they're unbiased, to make sure that the structure and the function and the language, a lot of times I'll be hired to look for holes because a lot of times they're really poorly done and they demonstrate a lot of biases. But yes, there are forensic psychologists out there that do these types of evaluations. Where I find there to be the most corruption and difficulty are custodial evaluations. These are mostly done by developmental psychologists or clinical psychologists who have never worked with perpetrators. And it astounds me how many of them say they've worked with victims, yet they tend to re-victimize the victims through these custodial evaluations. And they tend to lean towards 50-50 no matter what, because custodial evaluators are damned if they do, they're damned if they don't. They're the highest to be sued because one side always wins. The court likes these cases. Are they paid by
someone in particular, like one side?
Depends on the case.
Okay.
Sometimes they're appointed by the judge. Sometimes there's one party will say, here's 3, the other side picks 1. Sometimes they share the fees, sometimes they don't. That's really important to think about, who's paying for it and what does their narrative say when it comes back. But I think that the difficulty is the family court system has set it up in such a way that there's such an abundance of these cases that the custodial evaluators are so pressured into, I'm just going to say 50-50, no matter what the rest of this. I've read some evaluations. I'm like, how could you possibly conclude 50-50 after reading this? But this is what happens. The judge and the attorneys and everybody else who's making judgment just goes to the conclusion. And they don't see, and that's why I'm brought in, is to really wreck their world by going, okay, put the conclusion over here. Did you look at page 1 through 20? How did this person get 50-50? So it's,
and how type of things are you looking at when you do your assessments, like specific things?
I'll give you a perfect example of one that I just did.
Yeah.
In this case, the mother was, of course, the one that was being pathologized, and they were trying to say that she wasn't listening to what CPS had already said. And the first 50 pages of the report was dad's narrative, and the next 10 pages were mom's. And I made a pretty bold statement to the court when I was rebuttaling this through my review. And then I also said, the evaluator says that she has all this experience in DV, yet she's criticizing the mother for not believing the CPS report and the fact that law enforcement and CPS have looked at this 3 times and basically equating unfounded with false. And that's not true. Unfounded just means it hasn't met the statute of legal evidence. That doesn't mean that these children weren't abused. It just means it didn't meet the legal statute. And oftentimes it doesn't. There is no physical evidence. So the attorney actually crossed me and said, Dr. Barrett, don't you think after 3 CPS people looking at this and 3 law enforcement agencies, officers looking at this, that mom's just choosing not to believe it? And I said, why don't you go ask the family of Gabriel Fernandez what they think about that? Because how many CPS people pushed his case down the line? How many law enforcement agents diffused their responsibility? And this child was being locked in a cabinet and forced to eat cat food and ended up being killed by his mother. No, I don't. Why would I trust that? I know nothing about those investigations. So even the questions that I get during testimony, and I said to this attorney, I said, not only is that ignorant, it's offensive to think that we can just blindly believe a system because they've, I don't know, supposedly done their due diligence. And if there's no evidence, of course, they're going to mark it as unfounded. That just doesn't mean false. So these are some of the things that I'll look for in these evaluations to show the court justice has not been served.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Like I said, I wish my lawyer had thought to brought someone in to assess our situation, because we didn't have anyone touch us, not even like a guardian ad litem, which could have been helpful.
Yeah. And sometimes I have some great attorneys that I've worked with who are all about building a team. But I will say to some folks who are looking for attorneys to just be mindful of attorneys that are unwilling to work with a team, that are unwilling to be educated. That my job is not to come in and tell you how to run the rule of law. That's your lane. My job is to help you apply psychology to the law. And that's not what they've been trained to do. So if the attorneys are open to that, and many of them are, we end up building a great, I don't testify as much anymore, but what I do is a lot of private consultations, and I help the attorneys strategize their cases, help them reword deposition questions just to catch these people on the stand in lies.
Yes. I don't know why anyone wouldn't want to do everything they can to not only make themselves a better lawyer or judge or whatever, but we're putting innocent lives in their hands, these vulnerable children. So why not do everything that you can to learn everything that you can to make informed choices and decisions? I understand that.
I think it's because they have to admit they don't know everything.
That's
right.
True. But
don't come into my. Of course not. Of course not. You and I know that. But there are some egos that get in the way, and not just with attorneys, with psychologists. We have to admit when we're outside of our area of competency. I've had to turn down cases before that, for example, if they involve autism, neurodivergence, that's my specialty. And sometimes that's very relevant in these cases. I said, I can speak to this, but I can't speak to that. That's not my concentration. We have to be open. We cannot be experts in everything. We can't.
Sure. Now, how does different types of abuse come into play with risk assessment, like sexual abuse, different types of domestic abuse?
Yeah. So we always want to look at history. History is the number one predictor of future behavior if there hasn't been any sort of meaningful intervention. So what I mean by that is, are there people who can make progress in therapy if they have the capacity for reflection, the ego strength to tolerate the difficulty of getting through and staying amenable to treatment? Sure, there are. I'm still a psychotherapist. I still believe that therapy can be really effective. I just think we also, when we're doing risk assessment, we have to look at what are the risk factors that get in the way of this person profiting from experience. And what I mean by that is, did they learn from what they did? Is there remorse there? What risk factors are still present in this person's life that may increase their propensity for violence? What sort of dynamics do they have with the people in their life, with their work relationships, with their consistencies? One of the areas that gets tricky, and another thing that I brought up to these judges in July, was the court has something called stare decisis, which essentially means that once something has been presented and the judge has ruled that we're not talking about the abuse anymore, we've already been over this, we're not bringing it in again. I said, that's really a failure because this is ever evolving. And if the children are still seeing the allegedly abusive parent, and now we're no longer able to bring in new evidence. I know a lot of judges that will shut down evidentiary hearings when there's new evidence on a topic that they've already decided no longer and never existed. So I think that we also have to remember that there's an importance of looking at history. These are not incidents in isolation. Right. So we need to open up our mind and go, hey, if there's nothing to hide, let's talk about this full history of this person's relationship and interpersonal dynamics. I look at one of the number one things I look at is flexibility versus rigidity. Somebody's interpersonal style is maladaptive if there is zero room for flexibility in their thinking. Right. Can they be cooperative? Can they, and I don't mean that boundaries, I'm not talking about boundaries. Someone can say no because something is unhealthy. I'm talking more about, can someone look inward and say, I'm not perfect. There's room for me to grow here. Maybe I was wrong there. I'm looking for a capacity for somebody to be flexible, to be able to tolerate the word no, to tolerate the...
Well, narcissists won't.
Exactly. So what we're doing is, without even having to diagnose, is we're looking for arrogant and antagonistic interpersonal styles.
Okay. So that's something that you could have picked up on my case, because I feel like that was like a number one telltale.
Yeah. So there's that. And then I also know that he was involved with a cult. And so we also have to look at, what is this person's narrative? What are their potential delusions, cognitive distortions, things that are getting in the way of him being in touch with reality? And we know that there's really good clinicians out there that work with folks that have been in cults for some time, and the level of deprogramming that has to happen when they come out of cults. So if someone's still in that, again, without pathologizing him, you can say to the court, there's a deep concern that there's something very dogmatic that's happening that could get in the way of him effectively parenting or using judgment, for impairment in insight, impairment in judgment, impairment in flexibility. I'm not looking for someone to say, I haven't had any problems till her. Okay, that's a telltale sign. Calling their ex borderline. That's the big one too, right? Trying to flip the script and getting the victim on the defense is the biggest sleight of hand. If you ever have an attorney that is only going in there and trying to defend you, you're going to lose your case, because they want you on the defense. It takes all the emphasis off of highlighting what they've been doing. So we have to flip that script.
This is so fascinating. I love talking to you about this, because in my personal case, just hearing the things that you just said, it's just something that I've felt so strongly about from the beginning, because when I was told that's not really abuse, or he's just a scorned ex. First of all, he wasn't my ex. We only dated for a couple of weeks, and I had gotten pregnant. So we weren't we didn't break up. We didn't have that history. And he doesn't have a history of obviously killing people. So what are they to look at? And everything that you just said, the narcissistic remarks, the cult factors, the fact that he literally said he had post-traumatic stress disorder and mental illnesses. These are all things that a forensic psychologist or maybe just a logical person would assess that maybe we should look further into these things, because it was just brushed off. The judge literally said in our first hearing, that was years ago, the cult situation, because it was right out of college. He was like 20, and that's what he said. Like 20 years have gone by, so he must be reformed.
But see, Allie, that's what terrifies me, is these judges are making calls so outside of their areas of competency. Because just because someone has stepped out of this cult, what has he done since the cult? What do we know about his way of thinking? How do we not know that over this time, he still hasn't internalized the philosophies of this cult, even if he's not actively in it? There's a reason why people have to go to therapy sometimes for years after they come out of a cult, because you are traumatically bonded to someone who has completely worn you down and worn you out. You have no sense of self anymore. Okay. What you were told was once safe and rational and logical and empathic. You are now told all of what you learned early on in life is wrong. Someone doesn't just come out of that framework because they've stepped outside of the room of that church. And for a judge to make that kind of call with no mental health training, with no risk assessment training, with little to no DV training, this is the danger of the court system. And I know I've had many of conversations about, is it better to move to a jury system versus one judge? And that comes with its own issues. But it scares me that this is such a rush to judgment, and that this person could not recognize, hey, let's bring in some experts. Let's see maybe where this guy is now. And not for any reason than to protect your son, but they're so afraid to offend the parent. And it's all about making this fair for the parent who's the abuse is alleged upon, that we forget that the child is at the center of this. What would have been so bad about going, hey, we're going to pause here for a minute. We're going to assess some things. And the worst thing that comes out of it is that we've had to put you through some tests and everything's fine. But they just want to rush to judgment.
ABEL, and they threw it out.
Of course.
We didn't even get one.
Because you're the ridiculous one. You're the hysterical one. How could he possibly be a father and such a good dad if he was this crazy or cultish? And listen, both can be true. You can have someone who appears to be a good enough father without knowing behind closed doors where his mind is and how it could take one trigger for him to do something. And unfortunately, you're the cautionary tale.
That's why I do
and that should
podcast.
Never have happened.
Yes, absolutely.
That should never have happened.
He should have never even honestly gotten 50-50, because he wasn't even in Grayson's life. He wasn't even in the state. He didn't even live here. He wasn't on the birth certificate. He didn't want to be here for the birth. And he didn't sue for paternity until Grayson was 6 months old. 6 months. And then I had to just hand my baby to a stranger.
Yeah, they don't even question that. Like, why now does he want to show up?
He said because he's entitled to.
Yeah.
That he had DNA. The DNA makes everything perfect, and it's 50-50. Meanwhile, where was he the first 6 months of Grayson's life?
That's right. And I see this a lot, that these parents, oftentimes fathers, will step in and all of a sudden they care about being a parent because now this thing is happening and they want to weaponize the child against the mother. And again, we're still, as much as we don't talk about it and we pretend we're no longer there, when I say we, not necessarily us on this side of the lane of the aisle, but that Richard Gardner's philosophies around 90% of mothers lie is still embedded in these judges' heads. Although we have debunked that and it's closer to 1.3%.
Yeah, I'm all for fathers' movements and rights and them being involved, but at what expense? When I was young, my parents got divorced when I was like 6, and the norm was for you to go with the mom. It was called the tender years doctrine, I believe, back then. And they just completely got rid of that.
Yeah. And I agree with you. Listen, there's some really great dads out there. I've been on some cases with some really good dads who, ironically, in very different ways, have been through very similar things where, you know, the court aligns with the abuser and believes them at face value. Right. And the mothers who are abusers use very different tactics than the fathers. But at the end of the day, we also have to look at the social construction of things, whether people want to admit it or not, that women are historically less financially stable. They don't have the male privilege in society. They aren't believed as much. So are there fathers who are victims to this? Absolutely.
Sure.
And I've worked with some great dads, but I think that the majority of what we see is due to social construction and
Right.
and historically disbelieving women who allege this. And a lot of this rhetoric started with Gardner's garbage.
Interesting. I'm going to have to read more about him.
Yeah. I mean, he's the one that essentially discussed parental alienation syndrome as mothers
Right.
being hysterical and
Right.
and having sadomasochistic rape fantasy. The guy was off his rocker. And
Right.
family court is the only court system that still allows this terminology. Criminal court, civil court, they don't allow it.
What's so ironic is that I didn't have to tell Grayson's father that I was even pregnant. We weren't together. We lived in separate states. So obviously, I wanted Grayson to have a father, wanted him to have a relationship. I told him that I was going ahead with this pregnancy, and I gave him the opportunity, the choice to either step in or not. So you can't even say I'm trying to alienate the father. I'm the one that told him. I'm the one that tried to get them involved.
Yeah,
right.
That's right.
So
That's right.
I think people also forgot that. Like, why would I alienate the person if he wasn't even involved in our lives? I brought him in because I thought I was doing the right thing. And honestly, that is one of my biggest regrets because he didn't even have to know. And I would have my beautiful baby boy here today.
It's so awful. And I know you've heard the sentiment from so many people that what happened to you never should have happened. And it's true, as much as you've probably heard it, and maybe it sounds performative at this point, but the truth is no parent should ever have to lose a child that way. But more importantly, the judicial system that was supposed to protect you so profoundly failed and fails over and over again. And I don't know what it's going to take. If they're so cautious about protecting these like abusive people,
Right.
They're so scared to offend these people at the cost of these child's lives, at the cost of these mothers' sanity and ability to thrive. And you know better than I, but it's I don't even think frustrating is a strong enough word. It's so damaging.
Parental rights is trumping the actual situation.
That's right. Entitlement, right? Like the child is a property status of some kind versus their own individual being. And I think it's just going to take platforms like this and documentaries and exposure. I think more people outside of those who are involved or who have personally experienced need to understand that this is a thing. I just think that we have to continue to push, and it's hard. There's days that we don't want to fight. I can only imagine that there's days that you absolutely don't want to fight because that's been so much of your last 4 years is fighting. And that can also be really exhausting, but just think we don't have a choice.
Right. Yeah, I do not have a choice. I could stay in bed all day, but eventually I'm going to have to get up. I'm going to have to face the world. And the only way to help me face it is by sharing and helping other people so that this doesn't happen. And to get the people involved in my case and like them, the tools they need to become a better lawyer, judge, decision maker, because clearly they're all at fault.
I think where I get the most stuck and what I was trying to tell the judges that I've spoken to some at the conference, then I did another one remotely for judges in New York and Connecticut. I said, can we just learn to take a pause? Do we have to just assume that the mother's lying from the get-go until we have evidence? I'm like, what is the harm in just going, hey, let's put the kid first. Let's put the child first. Let's just air. Maybe mom is making this up, even if that's what goes through your head, which it shouldn't be, but let's just say it is. What is the harm? If this case is going to take 8 years because of his flipping antagonism anyway, let's use that pause productively and investigate this, like earnestly investigate it. And because most divorces, most custody battles that are between what I would actually consider high conflict. And when I say high conflict, I mean, there isn't like a personality disorder in the couple. It just means they can't stand each other. They want out. Those actually resolve fairly quickly. When cases have gone on this long, it's because you're dealing with someone who is maladaptive, personality disordered, psychopathic, sociopathic, whatever you want to name it. This isn't normal.
Right. Because normal co-parenting shouldn't have to involve the court so much.
Not for that long.
Not for that long.
Not to weaponize the court so much that I have had clients who have to go back to their home countries and leave their children here because the father has wiped them out of all financial resources on purpose and pathology. The list goes on, but I don't know at what point and how loud we have to scream for these judges to, and then where's the consequence? They just get to go
Right.
home to their families after they make these rulings.
Absolutely. There's absolutely no consequences. They have immunity, and what's done is done. Sorry is what I get. Sorry.
Yeah, I agree with you. Yeah.
So what have you learned over the course of your career that people should know when in a relationship with a narcissist or someone that's being difficult?
So it's easy for me to say this because people say trust your gut at the beginning, which can be really hard to do because some people go into these relationships without having a gut because maybe they've had a history of other relationships, dynamics, maybe with a parent or another partner. But what I would advise folks to do is the earlier on that you feel your boundaries aren't being respected, and there's going to be an aside to this, is to leave. Don't allow yourself to go any further. And what I mean by that is, if we have to know what our boundaries are what give us a sense of self. There are deal breakers. And if we go into relationships, the boundaries are actually not for the other person. They don't listen to them. They violate them. By restraining orders don't work. The boundaries are for us. It's for us to understand if someone pushes beyond something that we in our gut is feeling like this doesn't feel right to me. This is not what I stand for. And they persist. Persistence is not flattery. Persistence is abuse. So if you're feeling that, pause, because the sooner you can get out, you lessen the chance of that trauma bond, lessen the chance of that bond forming. It's really all about primary prevention. Women are made to apologize, ask for permission, and acquiesce to flattery and persistence. All of the old Hollywood films were Pepe Le Pew and all this. They're throwing themselves at the woman and we should be flattered and all this, and we're supposed to be coy and shut. No. And one thing I will recommend to anybody out there who's listening to this is read Gavin de Becker's The Gift of Fear. And I'll leave you with this. He says in the book, if a man is respectful, and again, I'm talking about this from a very hetero model. I also understand that this can happen in queer relationships. My relationship was with a woman. But in society, if we're looking at a man who's respectful, if a woman says no or no thank you, a man who's healthy will go, I respect that. I completely understand. And he gives an example of a woman walking to her car and a man coming up to her in the parking lot says, hey, let me help you with your groceries. Like coming off very charming, very nice, very non-threatening. And she says, no, thank you. I have this. And he says something like, bitch. Gavin Becker says, be a bitch. Be the biggest bitch you can possibly be. Stop acquiescing, apologizing, because anybody who is healthy, man or woman or any gender in between, if you say no and someone cannot tolerate, that is your biggest warning sign right there.
That's definitely something that I went through because in my situation, I couldn't leave. We weren't together. We didn't live together. So leaving just meant him spouting out insults and hurting me in ways and me just letting it roll off my shoulder. That was me saying no. Or if he wanted me to do something and I couldn't or didn't want to, I would say no. And all I asked for when I tried to get the injunction or restraining order was to pause for a second and get a hearing so I can talk to the judge and tell him what has been going on. But I didn't even get that opportunity. It's just difficult.
It's really difficult. And I think the more we talk about this and the more people are aware of what that early love bombing or focused attention might look like, we're all allowed to be excited at the beginning of a relationship.
Sure.
But where the biggest warning signs are is when that person will say something like, I'm going to marry you, and they've known you for 2 weeks, or they're already making these decisions. They're not asking, they're telling you, and they're getting very jealous very early on if you spend your time elsewhere. That's not excitement. That's, again, persistence. That's bullying. That's guilt. That's not healthy.
I got text messages in the same day that said, you're a disgusting, vile human being. How could you bring Grayson into a world like this? And then an hour later, get messages, you're a great mom. Let's get married and move to Hawaii. Literally in the same sentence.
Yeah.
That's when you know something ain't right.
That would be an overt one for sure. Yeah. You can't hide that crazy, but
apparently that wasn't enough.
And you know what? And I will say this too, is for people who have pursued the relationship despite those things, is one of the first steps in healing is really having self-compassion, that anyone can be baited into these relationships because these people are so good at making excuses for themselves. And if you are a healthy person and you've experienced healthy relationships, then our first sort of go-to is to give someone the benefit of the doubt because we can't imagine that someone would be that way. So a lot of the healing with clients that I work with at the beginning is just understand what's happened to you and understand that you didn't do anything to cause this. And that's oftentimes one of the biggest hurdles.
Yeah, no, it's definitely because you want to put blame somewhere. And a lot of it is inner. I have a lot of guilt myself, and I think about all the things I could have, should have done.
Yeah.
But in reality, it was out of my hands.
That's right.
I relied on people that could have made a difference that didn't.
Yeah. And it's really easy to go back to what we call that post-traumatic rumination but that isn't helpful, because in that moment you were doing all you knew how to do. Like, we can always reflect back and we can use that for future relationships, but to go back and try to relive the trauma and have all of that guilt is a normal part of the beginning of the work. But my hope for my clients is we get past that stuckness at some point, because that can become somebody's mental and emotional prison for the rest of their lives if they can't get out of that.
Yeah, 1000%. And it's hard. Now, tell everyone about your podcast.
Oh, so I have a very unrelated yet related podcast. So I have a podcast called Terror Talk Podcast. And my colleague and very good friend Shannon Calder and I were both psychologists, and we both understand narcissistic personality disorder very well. We also happen to be a very big fan of horror films. And so the podcast is much more pleasure, but we also talk a lot about mental health topics, but it's basically psychology, and it's horror and true crime from a psychological perspective. And so sometimes it's just fun around horror, but oftentimes we'll take very recent true crime cases. We dissected the episode Adolescence. So some of it's very topical to what we're also seeing in the world of NPD and how that, and what people can do.
Did you watch the Gabby Petito story or any of the current ones? The Menendez?
Yeah, the Menendez, the Petito, all of those are, especially as a forensic psychologist, and I know people who worked on those cases. It's, man, I cannot believe just how, and I know it seems like more now because there's documentaries every second, but it just seems like there's more and more each year.
There definitely are. I'm waiting for someone to pick up the rights on my story because I think it's a doozy.
And it needs to be, as long as you're willing, it needs to be told. People need to hear it.
And that's why I keep sharing, because people need to hear that these regular people in your lives could literally be the devil in disguise, and you have no idea.
No idea.
All right. I totally appreciate you coming on and sharing all your wisdom with us. And I find this fascinating, and I could probably talk for hours. So maybe we'll have you back on, but I appreciate it.
Thank you, Allie. And thank you for everything that you're doing. I think it's just so great that you're just giving people an opportunity to talk more about this. So thank you for having me.
Oh, absolutely. I think I was directed to you through Tina, perhaps.
I think so.
Yeah. And that's how I found you all the way on the West Coast. So I'm really glad we did. So it's nice to have a community.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you so much.
Right. We'll talk soon.
Okay.
If there's someone that you want to hear from on this podcast, please feel free to send me an email. Or if you would like to be a guest, please reach out at Allie@graysonschoice.org.